good king is killed because he got a little cocky and went into battle without asking for God's help. His sons, who ruled after him, continued to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Now we move forward in our study to the days of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thanks for joining us as we study 2 Kings chapter 24. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had Judah under his thumb. Judah's king, Jehoiakim, served him for 3 years and then rebelled against him. We'll say more about that later. But verse 2 tells us that the Lord sent many enemies against Judah to destroy it, as he had said that he would, because of the sins of Manasseh, a former king. God was not going to forgive the shedding of innocent blood that Manasseh had caused to be shed. Verse 6 tells us again where we could learn more about the deeds of Jehoiakim, where we could have learned these things because that book is not around any longer, and that he died and slept with his fathers. Also that his son, Jehoiachin, became king in his place. As a separate thought, verse 7 tells us that the king of Egypt stayed home, no longer went out to battle, because the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken everything that belonged to him. Now this latest king in Judah, Jehoiachin, was only 18 when he took the throne. And lo and behold, he only reigned for 3 months in Jerusalem as well. His mother was also named in the text. But more importantly, verse 9 tells us he too did evil in the sight of the Lord. Meanwhile, Nebuchadnezzar's army seizes Jerusalem, and the king himself visits Jerusalem. Jehoiachin and his mother, his servants, captains, and officials go to meet him. Verse 12 says, Nebuchadnezzar, in his 8th year of reign, took Jehoiachin captive and emptied Jerusalem of its treasures from both the house of the Lord and the king's house. He also cut into pieces all the vessels of gold that Solomon had made in the temple as God had told him to. Then verse 13 tells us everyone was led into captivity. No one remained in the land of Judah except the poorest people. Can we possibly imagine what that scene was like? I'm not sure we can do justice to that, even in our minds. And it also seems this was one time it may have paid off to be poor. Who knows? Besides his mother and his wives and servants and officials, verses 14 and 16 tell us the king of Babylon led into exile Jehoiachin's army personnel and craftsmen and smiths. Verse 14 says 10,000 in all, counting the residents, official, and soldiers, while verse 16 talks about 7,000 soldiers plus 1,000 craftsmen and metal workers. Now, there seems to be some repetition in these verses and maybe some overlap, but anyway you cut the cake, it was a lot of people being exiled. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't finished. Verse 17 tells us he made his uncle Mattaniah king in Jehoiachin's place and changed his name to Zedekiah. Now he was 21 years old and he reigned for 11 years in Jerusalem. Now it gets interesting because Mattaniah's mother, or Zedekiah's mother, was identified in the same manner as the mother of Josiah's younger son, Jehoahaz, who had become king earlier. That is Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. Now you can look at 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 31 to see that they're the same as they are in chapter 24. And supposedly this guy, Mattaniah, or now Zedekiah, was also the uncle of the king of Babylon, as I read it. Small world. In any case, he too did evil in the sight of God. And to the end of the chapter, we read that through the anger of the Lord, this all happened in Jerusalem and Judah until God, quote, cast them from his presence. And then the closing phrase of the chapter, you got to love this, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon, which we assume was his nephew, as we indicated earlier. Wow, let's stop there and dig a little further. Let's begin by saying that most biblical scholars and historians conclude that Jeremiah of Libnan, or Libnah, and Jeremiah the prophet, the better known of the two, were two distinct individuals. While they shared a common name, their lineage and geographic origins differ significantly in the biblical text. Some more background. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, was concerned with Judah because of its strategic position in relation to the empires of Egypt and Assyria. Therefore, it was important to him to conquer Judah and make it a subject kingdom, his vassal, if you like, securely loyal to Babylon. There were three separate encounters between Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiakim: 605, 597, and 587 BC, respectively. Sometimes we just never learn. Some may wonder how it came about that Jehoiakim, who was serving Nebuchadnezzar, turned and rebelled against him. Well, it appears that the campaign of Nebuchadnezzar was interrupted suddenly when he heard of his father's death and raced back to Babylon to secure, not to be with his father, but to secure his succession to the throne. He traveled about 500 miles in just 2 weeks, a remarkable speed for travel in that day. Nebuchadnezzar only had the time to take a few choice captives with him, such as Daniel, a few treasures, and a promise of submission from Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim took advantage of his absence and rebelled against him. Now, David Guzik reminds us that many in the days of Jehoiakim believed that God's will was to deliver them from their enemies and to preserve an independent Judah. Yet, that was not God's will. It was his will to bring Judah into judgment, knowing they had not genuinely repented and that they would not. The best thing for Judah to do was to submit to this will of God, as Jeremiah told them to do, despite great opposition. They didn't. Now, really astute Bible students will note that 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 9, 2 Chronicles 36, 9 says that Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he became king, whereas here we read that he was 18. The difference between these two accounts is probably due to the error of a copyist in Chronicles. But some Hebrew manuscripts, some Syriac ones and some Arabic ones, read 18 in Chronicles, so 8 must be an error of transcription. Also, with respect to the furniture and precious things of Solomon's temple, we note that some ancient traditions tell us that the prophet Jeremiah hid the Ark of the Covenant before this, so that it was not among the things that were cut up and carried back to Babylon. Among these captives, exiled, was the prophet Ezekiel, who compiled his book of the prophecies while in captivity in Babylon. And commentators Patterson and Austell say, with only the poor and unskilled people of the land remaining, it might be assumed that Jerusalem would cause no further trouble for the king of Babylon. The new king of Judah, now much reduced in size and power, was renamed Zedekiah, which means the Lord is righteous. The righteous judgment of God would soon be seen against Judah. But why did Zedekiah rebel against the king of Babylon that had placed him on the throne? Jeremiah tells us that there were many false prophets in those days who preached a message of victory and triumph to Zedekiah, and he believed them instead of believing Jeremiah and other godly prophets like him. Therefore, he rebelled against the king of Babylon. For example, Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 1 to 5 tells us that Jeremiah clearly told Zedekiah that he would not succeed in his rebellion against Babylon. Zedekiah arrested Jeremiah and imprisoned him for this, but the prophet steadfastly stayed faithful to the message God gave him. Furthermore, Knapp writes that, quote, he had no real faith in Jehovah, Israel's covenant-keeping God, and therefore did not scruple to break his covenant with Nebuchadnezzar. But how dearly he paid for this violation of his oath. End of quote. Matthew Henry adds one other interesting point here with which I will close. Jehoiachin's defeat was via the process of surrounding. He knew he could not win, of surrendering rather. He knew he could not win, and he hoped that the king of Babylon would let him stay on as the head of a meaningless vassal state. He was wrong. So much to draw from here in the way of applications, but in the interest of not going on any longer, we'll let you do that on your own. Join us next time when we look at Zedekiah's reign. Join us for that. In the meantime, if you like what you're seeing, please indicate so. Follow us on YouTube, digging for scriptural gems. But above all, keep on studying the Word of God.